All right, guys. So now we're going to do taxes. And I just pulled this from the textbook. So it tells you, or it tells us the overall structure of calculating taxes. So here you go. To determine, actually, let me hold it up with something else. So to determine your adjusted gross income, so for shorthand, we call it the AGI, you do the gross income minus the adjustments. And keep in mind that this information will be given to you when you're doing the taxes. So you just have to figure out which one's which and then subtract that out. And then for your taxable income, you do your AGI, and then we subtract out the exemptions and the deductions. And we'll talk about what those are. And finally, the last step to that is to determine the income tax. And you do the tax computation and you subtract out the tax credits that you may have. The computation part is the most complicated part, and we'll talk about it while we go through an example. But that's the overall steps. And on the exam, I'm going to give you these 3 steps for you to follow, along with the tax table that you need to have for the tax computation. So just keep that in mind that most of this information will be provided to you when you're going into the exam. You just have to know the process. So let's start. I took a problem. So if you want to see another example, I suggest that you look at page 447, and it goes through this example about a single woman with no dependents. So that's like a classic example for you to do. But instead of doing that, I pulled number 53 from our textbook, and we're going to do that instead because you already have an example that you can look at. So this is slightly different than the example that's given, and we'll go through it, and in the meantime, I'll explain each part. So this is what any of the tax questions are going to look like for our class, and for the sake of our class, we're not looking at several of the difficult, or I guess more complicated situations that may arise when we're actually doing taxes of our own. So it's pretty straightforward calculations. So unmarried head of household with 2 dependent children, and their gross income was $50,000. No adjustments. Deductions would be $4,500 for state taxes and $2,000 for theft loss. And they have a $2,000 tax credit. Okay, so let's get started. I'll show you side by side what we're gonna do. So the first part is to calculate our AGI, or adjusted gross income. Right? And that is our gross income minus the adjustments. So for this person, since they had no adjustments, it's $50,000, which is our adjusted or gross income minus 0. Or, in other words, our adjusted gross income is the same amount since there were no adjustments. Okay, so that's the first step. The second step was to determine the taxable income. Right? And the way we do that is we take our adjusted and we subtract out exemptions and deductions. So we take our adjusted for this person is $50,000, and we take out exemptions and also deductions. So we'll talk about that part. So let me, for now, write exemptions plus deductions. Okay? So we're going to look at the tax table. So this one, let's see, it's from 2008. So the table that they use every year is slightly different, and depending on the state and the federal, it'll be different as well. So let's see. This is a person who was unmarried, but he or she is a head of household, right? So for unmarried head of household, we're going to look at this last column. And this is pretty much all we need because we're not looking at married filing jointly or any of the other cases. The example, so you have to be careful which one you look at. All right, so for this one, head of household, so we're looking at this column. And if you look at standard deduction, it's $8,000. Exemption, this is per person, right, is $3,500. So we got to take into consideration how many people we're filing for and all that stuff. First off, there's two routes for deduction. I could either take the itemized or I could take the standard. All right, so let's compare those two to start off with. The standard deduction is $8,000. And if we look at our itemized deduction, if we add these two up, we get, let's see, 6,500, right? So if we, oh, I spelled that wrong. Itemized, it is 6,500. And our standard is 8,000. So the way you select which deduction to take is by taking the higher one. Because deduction means we're going to subtract that out from our amount. So overall, the higher your deduction and exemption, the lower your income tax will be. Okay, so you want to always pick the higher one. And this is not cheating in any means, like cheating the system or whatnot. This is set. So when you do taxes, they will always take the higher one of the two. If your itemized is greater, that's what you're going to take. But for our case, standard is greater, so we're going to take the $8,000. And then for exemptions, let's look back here. Per person was $3,500, right? So $3,500, and this person, so themselves with 2 dependent children, so a total of 3. Right? So if we multiply that out, okay? So for this case, our exemption is $10,500. If I was filing for myself, you would only take one, right? So if you look here, the $3,500 is across the board. But if you're filing single with no dependents, $3,500. However many dependents you have, you just multiply that amount. Right? So this is per person. And for this case, it's 3 because whoever is filing and then 2 dependent children. Now, putting that together, it's 50,000 minus 10,500 plus 8,000. Right? So we have 50,000 minus 18,500. So in other words, let me do it out. 3 zeros. 18,500. If we carry that out, 49, 10, 500, 1, 3. So what this is saying is our taxable income is $31,500. So as you can see, it's pretty different from our gross income. So our gross income was $50,000, but after we take care of everything, the taxable part is $31,500. So now what we do is we look at this value in our table, right? So $31,500 would be between these two. You can see it's between $11,500 or $451 and $43,650. And we're in the 15% tax bracket. So what we're going to do, you can think of it as kind of breaking this piece apart. So if our entire amount that we earn, and you can look at it vertically or horizontally, so 31,500 is our, like, how much we earned. For the first 11,450, we're going to pay 10%. And then for the next, we're going to pay 15%. So it's kind of broken down into parts, and we're paying a certain percentage based on our tax brackets. And that's just a system that we have here in the United States. So the way we do that, now we're doing percentages, right? So 10% is 0.1, 15% is 0.15, right? The 0 you can put there, but it's insignificant. So now we do the first 11,450 times 10%, and then we add, but keep in mind that this 15% is only from here to here, right? It's not from 0 to 31. So what we have to do is 31,500, and we have to subtract out $11,450 because we've already taxed on that, right? And then you multiply by 0.15. And so this, in general, and I'm going to leave it up to you to actually carry out the calculation, is the tax computation. Okay, and keep in mind that the last step was to subtract out the tax credit. And for this person, they had a $2,000 tax credit. So after you do all of that calculation, you're going to subtract out $2,000. And so this entire thing is how much they owe in taxes. So how much they have to pay. Okay. If you have any questions, please email me or do the Ask My Instructor button on your MyMathLab. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video lecture.